I'm Bob Savakinus. Welcome to our program in a nutshell. Today our special guest is Dr. Sean Brennan, local history expert, national history expert, and international history expert. He is a professor at the University of Scranton. He has published 4 books on numerous historical articles as well. Again, he's a professor at the University of Scranton, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about his books. We're going to talk about a program he's going to be doing with the Lackawanna Historical Society on William Scranton, Governor William Scranton, former Governor Scranton, and just about some of the things that he's been involved with. So, Dr. Brennan, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, I guess I'm going to just ask you the very simple question, what got you interested in history?
Well, I think it started when my family would take us to various historic sites all over the country. My father was an Army officer, so we moved around a lot. So wherever we moved to, they would take us to battlefields from the American Civil War or different historical sites. And yeah, that developed just an early interest in history when I was back in elementary school.
So tell us a little bit about what it's like. You've authored 4 books. Let's talk about writing these books. What is it like to author these books, first of all?
Well, it's an amazing process. You find yourself almost living with your subject or subjects over a period of 5, 6, 7 years. Like my second book, biography, I'll show this one first, a biography of a Passionist priest named Fabian Flynn, who was a World War II Army chaplain. He was at the beaches at Normandy on D-Day, was a confessor to some Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg, and then worked for Catholic Relief Services helping refugees fleeing communism. I worked on that project from about 2012 to about 2018 when it came out, and I almost felt like the Fabian Flynn was like a part of my life for a long time. Not maybe that I was literally living with him, but at least it was a part of my life. And I mean, one thing I try to do in writing when I do a writing project is try and write a little bit every single day, even if it's only a few paragraphs. Because at least, except for special days, holidays, things like that, because you always know you're working towards the goal. And ironically, that's something I got from a novelist. One of my favorite novelists is Stephen King, and apparently he tries to write every day. And there's no way I'm ever going to write as much as him, but I actually think that's, if you're going to be a writer, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, once you have a project, it's good to work on it a little bit almost every day.
So you're a professor at the University of Scranton. How would your students describe Dr. Sean Brennan?
Well, I think they describe me as someone who's very passionate about the material and about the past, because I've always believed that if you're not really interested in or passionate about your subject, students will pick up on it. And if the professor, who presumably has a PhD, isn't interested in this, they might think, why on earth should I ever be interested in this? So I've always said that even on days where I might be having a rough day or something like that, you always have to bring that energy and enthusiasm into the classroom. They'll also, I think, describe me as someone who sometimes puts movie or sports references into historical lectures as well. Try and make it a little bit more dynamic.
So over the years, it seems as if college doesn't focus that much on the liberal arts and everything like that. So, I mean, what do you see this generation of students like? I mean, are they interested in our history? Are they interested in the liberal arts field? What are your thoughts?
I think a lot of them still are, even students who I have who aren't history majors, who are the majority of my students. Often do seem interested in history if you, again, present it in an exciting and dynamic way. And I think, unfortunately, at least in the historical field, sometimes historians themselves have done a lot to undermine interest in history, often by publishing works that, frankly, are on very obscure topics and that aren't really written for any type of general audience in mind, or in some cases, when they teach history, either presenting it as very dry and uninteresting, or sometimes seeing themselves more as the prosecuting attorneys in the trial of Western civilization. And I think sometimes that tends to turn students off.
So you've authored 4 books now, am I correct with that?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about some of the other books that you've authored.
Well, my first book was an expansion of my dissertation at the University of Notre Dame, The Politics of Religion in Soviet-Occupied Germany. So that's about, as it says, it's about the Soviet occupation of Germany after World War II and the interaction between the Soviet military authorities and the East German political parties, especially the communists, and the leaders of the Catholic and Protestant churches in the Soviet zone of Germany, what becomes in 1949 East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic. So there had been some works written on the Soviet occupation of Germany, but not really on the question of religion. And I've always had a fascination with religious institutions in tumultuous time periods and under dictatorships, and an interest in both Russian and German history. So I had to find a project that could combine all of that into one project. And especially when you're in graduate school getting your doctorate in history, most people don't finish. And often because they picked a dissertation topic they weren't interested in. And you have to live with this project for a long time, so you better be interested in it. And fortunately, it held my interest. And I got to research in Moscow for 4 months and Berlin for 7, and so that was a fun experience.
So and this is just more of a personal question that I'm more fascinated by. So we had the breakup of the Soviet Union, and we now have, of course, the things that have resulted in our world history of observing what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine situation and everything like that. What are your thoughts on the dissolution of the USSR at that point and what it's become over the last 20, 30 years?
It depends on what parts of the Soviet Union you're talking about. Some, like the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, have made a fairly successful transition to a market economy, to liberal democracy. Others have had a much more bumpy road. Most of the rest have had a very difficult path. The Caucasus, for example, Ukraine, clearly moving, I think, thanks to Russia, on a more Western path now, but they've had major problems with corruption, a number of different revolutions since 1991. Russia slipped back into dictatorship in the late 90s under Vladimir Putin. And most of the Central Asian countries, democratic governments kind of exploded on the launch pad or crashed shortly after takeoff. Like I had a chance in 2016 to live in Kazakhstan for a few months, and that's a country still struggling with leaving behind the authoritarian legacy of the Soviet regime. But I've always argued that the changes brought about by the Soviet regime were so profound and so damaging, it was always going to be a very difficult transition for the countries that composed it out of it. And I think the Baltic states had a little bit easier because for the first 20 years of the existence of the Soviet Union, they weren't a part of it. And so I think it was easier for them to make that transition out. Unfortunately with Russia, like I tell my students, they've had 2 experiments in liberal democracy, 8 months in 1917 and 8 years from 91 to 99, and both of them failed. And I was in Russia in October of last year for a history conference a few months before the invasion, and people have asked, when are you planning on returning? And I was like, not for a long time. Not until the country is freer than it was. And it was sad because I remember when I lived there in 2006, Putin had only been in power for 7 years, and it wasn't fully a democracy, but it wasn't fully a dictatorship either. But when I went back there in 2015 and then last fall, the political mood had gotten a lot more oppressive, and the political system was clearly a lot more closed off than it had been. And it's sad to see that happen to a country. I know it's a happy story that the dictatorship falls and people live in freedom and can choose their own government, but often that happens in countries and then they slip back into dictatorship again. I think one thing a lot of people misunderstood, ironically, about Russia in 1991 was a lot of people thought, oh, this is just like Germany after 1945, right, after the Nazi regime collapsed. When in reality, the much closer historical parallel is Germany in 1918 after the Kaiser's empire collapsed. And then you have a democracy which lasts for a while, and then it collapses back into dictatorship. And that's what happened with Russia. And I would just say about Putin, unfortunately, he runs that country the way I would expect a former lieutenant colonel in the Soviet secret police, the KGB, to run a country. I've always said if you want to understand Putin, you need to understand the Soviet secret police, the KGB. And that goes a long way to explaining his rule.
That's certainly a great insight into what the world situation looks like now as far as Russia and the Ukraine. Thank you for your observations on that. I'm going to move into another subject and another big historical event that kind of happened in the area back in 1986 in the Ukraine, the Chernobyl disaster. Yeah. What were your thoughts on the Chernobyl disaster?
Well, in retrospect, there's 2 events that, in my opinion, kind of mark the beginning of the end of the Soviet regime. And some of them, you only look at it in retrospect. One is Chernobyl. Ironically, both of them happened in the provinces. And the other, that's in April of '86. The other is at the end of the year in Kazakhstan, where Gorbachev tried to appoint ethnic Russian to be the head of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, and it led to about 2 weeks of riots in Almaty, which was the Soviet name for the capital at the time. And ironically, those two events on the periphery showed that in the provinces, there was starting to be either Soviet authority was breaking down in the case of Chernobyl, or there were rebellions against it. And the ironic thing about Chernobyl is there had been nuclear accidents in the Soviet Union before. There had been in 1979 a major anthrax leak in Ekaterinburg that killed about 150 people, but if the winds had been blowing the other direction when this anthrax was released, it could have killed 100,000. The differences of all those in Chernobyl was the Soviet regime couldn't cover up Chernobyl, not to its own citizens and not to the rest of the world. And on one hand, Gorbachev kind of handled it initially the way Leonid Brezhnev would have, kind of deny there's a problem until it blows up in your face, and then have a cleanup operation, but not really protect the people who are doing it. But ironically, this was something Gorbachev could point to say, as he said to his wife Riza, we can't live like this any longer. So no Chernobyl, no glasnost, and no perestroika, Gorbachev's attempts at reforms. And those reforms end up destabilizing the entire Soviet Union. And that's the ironic thing is the Soviet Union broke apart due to a combination of ethnic tensions and political upheavals that I think Gorbachev certainly accelerated. I've always believed that if Gorbachev hadn't attempted his reforms, which destabilized the system, the Soviet system probably could have lasted another 10, 15 years. But he does make those reforms, but he couldn't have made them without the disaster of Chernobyl, which pointed out the decrepitude and the weakness of so many aspects of the Soviet regime. Because if you look at Gorbachev, he becomes General Secretary in March of '85. Chernobyl's 13 months later. His first year in power, he doesn't do too much to change things. He did want to change some things. He wasn't exactly sure what, but there were so many entrenched interests in the three pillars of the Soviet regime: the party, the military, and the secret police, the KGB. And Chernobyl enables him to finally break through their resistance and bring about these attempts to liberalize it, to democratize it a little bit, which ends up destabilizing it. And I think it's ironic that, Gorbachev in 1989 has the first democratic elections in Russia since 1917 for the Congress of People's Deputies, this new lower house of the Soviet parliament that you didn't have to be a Communist Party member to be in, right? And 200 years earlier, 1789, is when the French Revolution begins, when Louis XVI opens the Estates General to allow his own subjects a little bit of a voice in their government. And there was a great French political theorist named Alexis de Tocqueville, and he said the most dangerous time for a dictatorship or an authoritarian system is when it's trying to reform, when it's trying to open up and democratize, because usually that gets botched. The people get a little bit of freedom, and then they want a whole bunch, and the leader doesn't know how to handle it, and the system ends up imploding. And it's fascinating to watch historical examples. I mean, the French Revolution and then the Russian Revolution, the third one of the 20th century, the one in '91, and the Eastern European ones that come 2 years before it, they have a lot of differences, but they have some important, fascinating things in common, too.
Well, Dr. Brennan, that's a great observation on it, kind of the situation of what was the USSR and what has become Russia and the modern world and everything. I'm going to turn our focus a little bit more to our local level. Mm-hmm. I understand you have a fourth book that's going to be coming out, and it deals with former Governor William Scranton from our areas. So
it does. It's actually part of this big writing project on the United Nations. I have a book coming out in December 15th. I was joking with my mother yesterday. It comes out on her birthday. I promised her I wouldn't send it as a birthday present. It's a history of the Cold War, looking at America's first two ambassadors to the United Nations: Warren Austin, who's Truman's, and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was Eisenhower's. And so after I finished the book and the manuscript, I was like, I want to do a little bit more with American ambassadors to the UN. And I also want to do something in local history, because Scranton's been my home since 2009. I didn't grow up here. First time I came out here was for the job interview in February of '09, but it's my home. And I wanted to learn about an important local figure, or local figures. And I saw that William Scranton had been Gerald Ford's ambassador to the United Nations from 76 to 77. And I was like, well, let's do one more thing on this. Let's write an essay on Scranton, because I didn't think there was enough room for a book, and publish it, present it. And this can be kind of the postscript to the book, to take the story from the 40s and the 50s to the 1970s. Because I think in terms of my writing interests, I mainly have written on the 40s, 50s, early 60s, and now I'm moving into the 70s and the 80s. So it's kind of this is kind of the bridge, if you will, this project on William Scranton and his UN service.
So I want to get into, I guess, that you'll be doing a Zoom program. The Lackawanna Historical Society, the Catlin House, I know since the COVID situation developed a few years back, they started doing Zoom programs, and I believe they've done about 50 on local history topics, and you could access all that information through the Lackawanna Historical Society to view some of their past guests that they've had on. And I just want to take a quick look at my notes here to say that you will be presenting on September 30th, William Scranton in the United Nations, 1976 to 1977, and again, this will be a Lackawanna pastimes program through the Historical Society. So can you tell us a little bit about what people can expect with this?
Well, you'd think, oh, he was only UN ambassador for a year. Couldn't have been that important. But a lot of important things happened in that year. There's a lot of fascinating historical issues of the mid-1970s that Scranton was just thrown in the midst of. He had to deal with the final end to a lot of European empires and having their former colonies enter into the United Nations, and the Ford administration wanted to make sure that these countries don't become Soviet allies. So we need Scranton to reach out to these new delegates, be very welcoming to them, maybe attend their independence ceremonies. Then he has to deal with the big issue in the 1970s, which was terrorism. This was, of course, the famous raid on the famous hijacking of the Air France flight, which was taken to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, and some Israeli commandos rescued the hostages and killed the terrorists, also killed a number of Ugandan soldiers protecting them, and Scranton had to go to the UN to support Israel's determination to do this on self-defense, and the controversies that the Soviets and a lot of the Arab states were trying to get Israel compared to South Africa as an apartheid state. And Scranton argued that the United States doesn't have to necessarily support Israel in everything, but we can't let it get lumped in with South Africa. And so he was trying to take a middle ground with that. And then also, it's also the era of détente, right? Cooperation between the Soviets and the West, coming out of the Vietnam War, for example, coming out of Watergate. And you have this big conference the year before Scranton becomes UN ambassador at the Finnish capital of Helsinki. And you have all the NATO countries there and all the Warsaw Pact countries there. And they sign these arrangements where the NATO countries say to the communist countries, we're not going to try and change the borders after World War II. We're not going to try and change your political systems by force of arms, which was a big deal for a lot of the Warsaw Pact countries because, like Germany, for example, until just a few years before, didn't recognize Poland's borders or Czechoslovakia's ones. They were still claiming them as German territory, the West German government, right? And also, there was a big honor for them to negotiate as equals because for a lot of Western countries, it's like, why bother talking to Warsaw or East Berlin or Budapest or Prague? Just talk to Moscow because it dictates everything they do anyway. But the Warsaw Pact countries and the Soviet regime agreed on paper to respect Western definitions of human rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. So Scranton was a big advocate on the floors of the United Nations, of the United States taking a much more active role of promoting human rights in the communist world, and using the fact that these regimes had signed these documents at Helsinki to respect human rights. And Scranton was like, I know they're not planning on doing that, but we can call them out on it and help dissidents and human rights activists in Eastern Europe. And that led him into conflict with Gerald Ford's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who was less enthusiastic about using human rights as an engine of U.S. foreign policy and on pressing the Soviets and their client states too much on this because that might jeopardize agreements on arms control, for example. And in many ways, and I say this in the paper, Scranton gives this great farewell speech called Human Rights, Let's Mean What We Say. And it's funny, some things don't change. He points out the Human Rights Commission is often full of dictatorships itself who just want to cover up human rights abuses. And later, the Carter administration in the late 70s. I mean, Carter and his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, make this a really big push for U.S. foreign policy on this going forward, and not just in the Soviet bloc, but all over the world. And in terms of a local connection, I mean, Scranton was obviously in New York, but he entertained a lot of foreign delegates, and a lot of delegations, and a lot of his staff at his home in Dalton. It was a famous kind of retreat center for various delegations of various different countries to meet with the Americans to talk about a lot of issues. So Dalton, at least for about a year, became kind of an important center of UN activity during that time period. Another thing I found out, his predecessor, Daniel Moynihan, had really alienated a lot of his own staff and would get into these really intense, angry, bitter arguments with delegates on the floor of the UN. Not just public speeches, but also just in the meeting halls and things like that. So Scranton kind of had to come in and clean up the mess and deal with the kind of Moynihan's complicated legacy. But he was fairly successful, both with a lot of foreign delegates and with a lot of the members of the American staff of the United Nations. I got a chance to interview his aide, who was a Coast Guard admiral named John Fagel, who's still alive, and he said that people like to call Scranton Mr. Nice Guy because of that. And one other thing I think is fascinating about Scranton was that Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford had offered him all of these different positions in their administrations. And Scranton had done a number of unofficial ones, like he was Nixon's envoy to the Middle East and to Europe in the late 60s and early 70s, but nothing official, nothing permanent after he leaves as governor of Pennsylvania. And his position as ambassador to the United Nations was the first actual official position he had taken in a Republican administration. But he took a lot of pride in it, from what I found. That was one of the most proudest aspects of his service, was his year as UN ambassador. I mean, he gets replaced when Carter becomes president, so he's only in for a year. If Ford had been elected, he might have served longer. But it was still an eventful year. Quite a bit happens that I'll be going in on the Zoom presentation.
So just out of curiosity for our viewers, I mean, what is the process to become the United Nations ambassador?
Well, it depends on how much importance the president attaches to the United Nations.
So it's a presidential appointment.
It's a presidential appointment, exactly. But it is a serious appointment given the importance of the United Nations. Obviously, you can debate how important it is now compared to then, but it's still an important position. And also, some presidents have made the appointment to UN ambassador a cabinet-level position. Others have not. So, for example, Warren Austin, who was our first permanent representative to the United Nations, Truman didn't have him in his cabinet, and Truman rarely consulted with him, right? But his successor, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., Eisenhower elevated him to his cabinet. And he basically said, after John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, you're the #2 person in foreign policy. And John F. Kennedy made Adlai Stevenson a cabinet level, who was his ambassador to the United Nations, who had been the governor of Illinois, had ran against Eisenhower twice. He was in Kennedy's cabinet. But some other presidents have gone back and forth. Scranton was not on Ford's cabinet. He met with him a lot, but he wasn't officially on the cabinet. And some Democrats have had UN ambassadors on their cabinet, others have not. So it's kind of in a middle ground where it's more, even if you're not in the cabinet, it's a more important ambassador position than almost any other. But depending on how much the president wants to emphasize to the UN, you may be on the cabinet or you may not be. You might be a very important person along with Secretary of State in terms of implementing U.S. foreign policy, or you might not be. You might just be ambassador to the UN. It depends on the president. It depends on the ambassador.
So as far as your research goes, I mean, any stories from the Scranton family or something about what their thoughts were, personal stories about their privilege of having their family member as a United Nations ambassador from here in northeastern Pennsylvania?
Well, from what I have read and from what Fagel told me, they did take a lot of pride in that position, that they felt like Scranton was making a real impact for the benefit not only of the United States, but its relations with a lot of other countries in the world. And I got the impression that they would have been more than happy for him to have served additional time. And Ford would have almost certainly kept him on. I mean, Moynihan resigned in '76 because otherwise Kissinger said, I'm going to fire you. So you have a choice. You can resign or get fired. And Scranton's really, even if Scranton and Kissinger didn't exactly see eye to eye on the value of promoting human rights at the United Nations, they got along much better. And I got the impression that that's something they wish, that Scranton's service to the UN was something they wish could have continued a little bit longer.
So tell us a little bit about the book. How can we purchase the book? When is it coming out? All the details. I know you gave us a little bit of a tease on it. So.
Oh, sure. And before I get to that, super quick, before I forget, I also have a primary source collection that just came out, which I translated from Russian into English, called The KGB and the Vatican. It's documents from a KGB dissident, a defector to the United Kingdom named Vasily Mitrokhin, who copied thousands, tens of thousands of secret police documents and summarized them. And these are just the documents relating to the Soviet secret police's relations with the Vatican from the 60s to the 80s. So I did the translation and wrote a historical introduction. But the other book, and I'm sorry I don't have the cover image, it's got Warren Austin holding up a Soviet automatic rifle during the, that was discovered in the Korean War, and then Henry Cabot Lodge pointing to a map of the Soviet Union. But it's called Warren Austin, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., and the Cold War at the United Nations, 1947 to 1960. It's published by Lexington Books, which published my first book, Politics of Religion in Soviet-Occupied Germany. It's a part of Rowman and Littlefield. And it's available, they're still working on the price. It's available on Amazon, though. It's available through Rowman and Littlefield's website, and it's available on Barnes & Noble. So if you just type in, if you go to one of those websites and type in, you know, Sean Brennan, Warren Austin, or Sean Brennan, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., it'll pop up. One other fascinating thing about that book, I say this in the introduction, is that some writing projects, their origins go back decades. Like I say this in the introduction to the book, but when I was a senior at Rockhurst University, it's the Jesuit school in Kansas City, it was my senior spring, and so I took a course in presidential leadership, and I read a book on Woodrow Wilson from the 50s. And the book talks about, it's kind of ironic that Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. shot down Wilson's plan for the United States to join the League of Nations. And now his grandson represents America at the United Nations. And I thought, that's fair. I wonder how that happened. I didn't even know there was a Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. I was like, one day I'm going to have to look at this in a little bit more detail. And it took me a long time. It wasn't until I finished the Flynn book, but I finally did. And I got to interview Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.'s son, and he said that his father would tell him, yeah, grandfather Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. would have been fine if America joining the United Nations. So I didn't see, just not the League of Nations, because that would have limited American foreign policy. So there wasn't a contradiction there, you know. But I thought, is this just an ironic bit of historical trivia, or is this really important? And I found it was an important subject, so I wanted to devote my time to it.
Well, I want to thank you for being our guest today. You certainly offered us a very interesting perspective, starting with internationally, Russia, the Soviet Union, and bringing it right on down to where we are locally. So I'm going to, encourage our viewers and everything to tune in to the Lackawanna Pastimes through the Lackawanna Historical Society on September 30th at 2 o'clock, where you're going to talk about
William Scranton and his UN service from 76 to 77.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Sean Brennan, for being our guest today with us here on In a Nutshell. I'm Bob Savakinus. Thank you for tuning in.